1945, thousands of Canadians were killed and injured in that war. In conversation with Mark O'Neill, the President and CEO of the Canadian Museum of History and Canada's War Museum. Mark, the 75th anniversary of World War II is upon us, and that's an important piece of history for the museum to recognize.
It is, and as you would imagine, we'll be doing a major show looking at how Canadians fought in this global war next year. So that will be one of the major presentations in the Canadian War Museum. But we'll also look at other smaller aspects, not smaller aspects of the war, but smaller lenses looking into that war. So, for example, Canadians in Asia, the Canadian Forces Artist Program, these kinds of things will be on the agenda as well. And a number of public programs that will aid us in terms of presenting some sort of thoughtful discussion and discourse to our visitors about why we felt it was important to commemorate the 75th anniversary.
I've been to both of the museums, but one of the things I can remember that really struck me when I was in the Canadian War Museum, this is probably going back about 5 years ago, I remember turning around a corner and coming out of that space, and there was a car that had been used by Nazi leader Adolf Hitler from the German during the Second World War, and I can remember being struck by the bullet holes that were in the car. How did the museum get that acquisition?
You know, Jamie, it's one of the more odious artifacts in the museum, to be honest. You know, it's very controversial. It's probably better placed now in the new museum than it was in the old museum on Sussex Drive, which, you know, to be fair to that building, was not purpose-built as a museum, and it was very difficult to interpret and show artifacts. The car now that you're referring to came to the War Museum in 1970. It was purchased by the museum from a Quebec businessman named Claude Pratt. And the long history is that the Americans discovered it in about 1945, and it eventually made its way to Canada, and then in 1970 to the War Museum. We do know that Hitler used it. It's been researched by a number of the curators over the years. Former curator Cameron Pulsifer in particular did an important piece on the car. We know, for example, that he would have driven in the car in 1940 to the building that replaced the Reichstag that had burned down. So it was definitely used by Hitler. And we try to use it now where you would have seen it to sort of interpret the rise of the dictators. So it helps us to do that, I think, in a very meaningful way. Again, the importance of artifacts. And then very briefly, when you turn the corner and you leave the gallery dealing with World War II, you get a glimpse of the car from the back amidst the ruins of Europe. So it's a very powerful interpretation, I think, of that particular aspect of the Second World War.
You mentioned in your statement that it was controversial.
Right.
I can imagine that some of the things, history is not always kind.
Right.
Sometimes there must be a real balancing act about what gets displayed and how it is displayed.
Right. You know, when we built the new War Museum and opened it back in 2005, we made a decision that the story had to be comprehensive and it had to be honest, as one of our creators said, warts and all. So otherwise, it comes back to this whole issue of integrity and authenticity in museums. And so you're right, in the War Museum, you will find the story of Hill 70 in World War I, the Canadian victory at Vimy. You will find these foundational stories that are a part of our history. You'll also find the internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II. You'll find the internment of Ukrainian Canadians and other members of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I, even while their countrymen were fighting, and one of them, Philippe Conneval, is winning the Victoria Cross, you know, at Hill 70 in World War I, while, you know, his fellow Ukrainian Canadians are being interned as enemy aliens. So those stories are all there, and we felt it was very important to present to our visitors a rich, important, and honest narrative about Canada's military history.
Do a lot of military members or veterans go to the museum? They
do. In fact, veterans are amongst the individuals to the museum, the visitors who are not charged to come to the museum, and many of them are critically important as our volunteers. I think one of the things that makes the War Museum such an interesting and unique space is that you will encounter veterans who are working in the exhibits, sort of back of house, as we call it, in the library and archives. Some of them are doing fundraising for us. They're a critical part of the museum operation, but certainly serving members of the forces and veterans come to the museum in large numbers, and we're very proud that they do and that they feel so comfortable in the building.